Welcome back to our Tanya class. We're learning chapter 4 today, and today's lesson is going to be in the honor of the land of Israel, all the Jewish people in the land of Israel, all the Jewish people everywhere in the world, any Jewish person that's in a difficult situation, any soldiers that are on the front lines, any Jews that are taken hostage. This class and all the learning that comes from it is in your honor, that you should be safe and everything should be good with you, and to the complete victory of the Jewish people against any enemy. So we're continuing to discuss. We started speaking last chapter about the 10 levels of the soul, which are 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. In other words, there's the intellect and the emotions. Now, those intellect and emotions are part of you. They're who you are. They're the person. That's the very fiber of your essence. That's part of your essence, really. That's part of who you are. And the godly soul, as essence, is also has these 10 levels. The intellect and emotions of the godly soul, which we explained in chapter 3, are part of the godly soul's essence. As we see practically, which is tangible proof, when a person has a desire to do something, immediately that desire comes into their intellect, or immediately that desire comes into their emotions. That's a sign that their desire that they have in essence and their emotions, their intellect, are connected, and it's almost like it'll spontaneously go from your essence, the desire will spontaneously go from your essence to your intellect or emotions, which is a sign, which is proof really, that your intellect and emotions are one with your essence. However, now we're going to find out that there are 3 things which are outside of your essence. Without any further ado, chapter 4, Perek Daled. V'od yesh lechol nefesh elohit shlosha levushim. So there's actually 3 garments. Garments is something that's outside of a person. In other words, you are not the clothes that you're wearing. The clothes are something outside of you. Clothing is an example of a thing that is outside of the person, and they express themselves through their clothes. A person expresses their inner selves through the clothes that they're wearing. So too, the godly soul has 3 clothings, which are thought, speech, and action. Thought, speech, and action. Those are the 3 clothings. Now, the thought, speech, and action are not part of the essence of the godly soul. In fact, they actually conceal the essence. When a person speaks, for example, their intellect is concealed. You don't know what they're thinking. At the same time, also, their emotions are concealed as well. In other words, these 3 garments of thought, speech, and action conceal the essence. They cover over so that you cannot know what the essence is within them. However, they at the same time reveal the essence as well to the outsider. So, for example, when someone speaks to you, you're having a revelation of what's going on their inside. They're telling you about what they're really thinking, but at the same time, that's not their actual thought itself, that's not their actual intellect itself, and therefore it could be that they're lying, for example, or whatever it may be. So in other words, on the one hand, it conceals, and on the other hand, it reveals. A clothing is something that's foreign. It's something outside of you, and it doesn't reach the essence, but it's just like a clothing that you're putting on and taking off. And therefore, for example, your thoughts, which are the first garment, are also like a garment that every second you'll see that you're always thinking thoughts. These thoughts are changing. It's not one constant thought. Very frequently your thoughts will change from one thought to another thought to another thought to another thought. And that's a sign that what is your intellect doing at that time? It's putting on one garment of thought, taking off the garment of thought, and putting on a second garment of thought, taking that off, and so on and so forth. Taking off garments, putting on garments. And that is a sign that it's outside of you. These 3 garments. And when it comes to the godly soul, they can only be the 3 garments of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah. As we know, there's 613 commandments, or mitzvot in Hebrew, of the Torah. The Torah has 613 commandments for every single Jew. And the only way that the godly soul can actually be revealed in a person's 3 garments is through the 613 mitzvot. In other words, the only garments that the godly soul owns, for example, let's say, for example, like the wardrobe of the godly soul is these mitzvot, these commandments. The 613 commandments is the wardrobe. The godly soul has no other way of revealing itself. It cannot express itself any other way. It's only through the mitzvot, the 613 commandments, that it can actually express itself. That means a person can do very spiritual things and go on the top of a mountain and fast and do all kinds of kumbayas and so on and so forth, but the godly soul is not going to be revealed. The only way that a Jew can reveal their Jewish godly soul is through the 3 garments of the mitzvot, of the 613 commandments, as we're about to explain. Shekeshah for example, as follows. Shekeshah mekayim b'ma'aseh kol mitzvot ma'asiyot. When a person with the 3rd garment of action does with action all the practical action-based mitzvot, commandments, and with the 2nd garment of speech, the person, the Jew, deals with the explanation with speech of the 613 mitzvot and their details and laws. And with the 1st garment of thought, anything that he's able to understand in the 4 levels, the 4 components of the Torah. Then the 613 limbs, so to speak, of his godly soul is enclothed, is garbed with the 613 commandments of the Torah. Ubifratot. So that's the basically what we're getting at is that there's not just 10 levels, but the godly soul in a certain way also is made up more generally of 613 aspects. There's 613 levels in every godly soul, which correspond to the 613 commandments. And when a person does, let's say, for example, a commandment with their hand, for instance, let's say giving tzedakah, giving coins to someone that needs it, then they're revealing, the limb, so to speak, of the arm of the godly soul, right? So the godly soul is made up of limbs, and through the 613 limbs, and each limb can be revealed through an individual one of the commandments, as we're going to see soon. ובפרט בחינת חוכמה בין הדת שבנפשו מלובשות בהשגת התורה שהוא משיג בפחדס כפי יכולת ושורש נפשו למעלה. Now, so when a person now, like we're saying, uses their intellectual faculties, which are the 3 that we mentioned in last chapter, Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat, those are the 3 intellectual faculties, then he is garbing the 3 intellectual faculties with the garb of the commandment of the Torah, which is the understanding of the 4 levels of the Torah. And the 4 levels are Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, famous, which are called the Pardes. Pardes is the acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. In English, Pshat is I'll say like this, the Torah has 4 levels. And it's kind of like a cake, let's say, for example. You have, let's say, a cake that's a 4-layered cake. You have the outer layer, the 2nd layer, the 3rd layer, and the 4th layer, which is the deepest layer. So in the Torah, there would be, in English, the simple understanding, which would be pshat, and then you have the hinting aspect of the Torah, which is remez, then you have the interpretations, which is drush, and then you have sod, which is the mystical element of the Torah, the 4 elements. And to give an example, when it comes to waking up in the morning, the first thing that a Jew does when they wake up in the morning is they say the prayer, Modeh ani lefanecha, melech havakam shechazarta bi nishmati b'chem l'ra b'amunatecha. We say thank you to God for returning our soul with great mercy. Abundant is His faith. So this can be understood on 4 levels, like we're saying. There's the simple meaning, which is saying, thank you, God. I woke up in the morning. Thank you for giving me for my life. Thank you for restoring me my life. You're just saying thank you. That's a simple meaning. remez, the second layer, which would be hinting. Over there, we see how how do we interpret this prayer? This prayer hints to the resurrection of the dead that's going to happen in the future when Mashiach comes. That, as we know, when a person sleeps, it's considered 1/60th of death, because 1/60th of their life is, so to speak, taken away from them while they're sleeping. And so what happens in the morning is they're resurrected. 1/60th of them is resurrected. And thus that is a hint to the resurrection of the dead in the future. And that's the second layer. The third layer is the interpretation aspect, which would be saying, oh God, you held my soul at night. You were keeping my soul as a deposit. And I'm saying thank you to you for returning me my soul, even though I may still be obligated to give you something. You're returning something while you're returning my soul while being forgiving of the things that I'm obligated to you, God, and I haven't paid you yet. You're still being forgiving and giving me back my soul, which we can all learn a lesson in day-to-day life, that when we're holding something from someone else and they are not giving you what they're required to give you, to be merciful as well, like God is, and to give it back. That's the third layer. And the fourth layer is the Kabbalistic, the mystical meaning of the Moda'ani, which is the resemblance of the way that the soul is living on a level of the 10th level of Malchut, and the way it is one with Yisod, which is on the Kabbalistic realms. And then there's actually a more general level, which is the Chassidut, the Chassidus, which is actually what we're learning now, the Chassidus interpretation of Moda'ani, which kind of comes and encompasses all the other four explanations of Moda'ani, which is the expression saying to God, the Moda'ani that I have can never be lost. That means, because in the morning what happens is a person's hands are impure, according to the Torah's guidelines. Now, when a person wakes up, their hands have to be washed first thing to be purified, right? So what we're saying is that even in a time that we're impure, we still have that soul. We still have that soul that's one with God. We still have that Moda'ani, and we'll never lose that Moda'ani no matter what. That's the Chassidus explanation. So what do we see from there? That there's different levels in learning the Torah. And when a person goes ahead and uses their thought, or their speech as well, as we'll see, to learn it, then they're garbing with that thought their intellect of the godly soul, and they're, so to speak, uplifting the level of intellect of the godly soul. And now he says also that there's two things. There's the understanding that a person has, and then there's also the level that a person's rooted, the level of that their soul is rooted. And these are two things that play into the factor of a person's connection to the Torah. You have a person's intellectual capabilities, and then you have a person's soul connection, what their soul connects to. So you have, these are two different things. So you can have someone that has a very broad intellect and understands things very well and is able to explain and give very nice explanations, but they don't have a soul connection to the thing. And that's, for example, the story of Rav Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo, who is known as the Mechaber, and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, which is the basis to the Judaism that we practice nowadays. The entire Judaism that we do is based on the Shulchan Aruch. Day to day, everything that Judaism is practically is based off the code of law called the Shulchan Aruch, written by this man, Rav Yosef Karo. He wanted to learn Kabbalah, the mystical dimension, from the Arizal. And every time the Arizal, I should say, was the founding, one of the fathers of Kabbalah. Now, every time the Arizal would teach the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, every time he would teach him Kabbalah, he would start sleeping and dozing off. So the Arizal told him, you're dozing off, that means that Kabbalah is not for you. I'm sorry, your soul isn't connected to it. And this is a man, Rav Yosef Karo, who was intellectually capable more than anyone. I mean, he was one of the geniuses of Jewish history. And yet, he didn't have a soul connection to Kabbalah. He understood Kabbalah. He even wrote books of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. He even had very spiritual experiences. But his soul wasn't connected to the dimension of Kabbalah. He didn't have the soul connection. And vice versa, at the same time, you can have a person who doesn't have an intellectual, very, very impressive intellectual capability, but at the same time, their soul is connected to certain things. As the Talmud relates of those that can tell you the halakha, they can tell you the practical thing to do, even though they don't even understand it so well. But they can tell you the bottom line because they have a soul connection to it. So these are the two things that play in to the connection to Torah and the grasp of the Torah. So that's the intellectual side of the garment of the godly soul. V'hamida, now comes the emotional. Shen yira ve'ahava, which are, as we mentioned earlier, generally composed of two, fear and love. Ve'anfehen v'toldotein, and their branches and offshoots. Milubashot b'kiyum hamitzvot b'maise u'b'dibur shutalmu Torah shekeneged kulan, which are also garbed. The emotional aspect is garbed as well by the three garments of thought, speech, and action. So again, the thought, speech, and action garb not only the intellect, but they also are a garment for the emotional, and especially the speaking of Torah, which is equivalent to all the mitzvot. Ki ha'ava hi shoresh kol hamach mitzvot eser. ממנה הן נמשכות ובלעדה אין הן קיום אמיתי. כי המקמן באמת הוא האוהב את שם השם, וחפץ לדווקא בו באמת. ואי אפשר לדווקא בו באמת, כי אם קיום רמ"ח פיקודין, שנחמך איברין דמלכה כביכול. So, a person, the only way to have an emotional connection to God is by doing something that He wills of you to do. Because God in essence is one, and nothing else exists besides for God. So if I'm someone that loves God, then there's no way that I'll connect, because I'm a something. I'm a something that's in love with God, which means that I'm a something. But in God's reality, He is one and nothing else exists. So there's no way that I and God can exist at the same time. The only way to express that love is by becoming a vehicle for Him, by becoming a vehicle for His will and for His expression, which is like we said, there's 613 commandments. Those are split up into two. There's 248 positive commandments, which is do A, do B, do C. And then there's 365 negative commandments. Don't do this, don't do that. So the way to actually actively connect to God is not through sitting there and thinking, oh, I love God, because like we said, that means that you're something outside of Him. And that means you can't coexist together. The only way to attach truly to God is only through fulfilling the 248 positive commandments, which are the 248 limbs of the king, as it says in the Zohar. So to speak, God has 248 limbs. What does that mean exactly? Which are the 248 positive commandments? The visual is of the limbs of a body, of, let's say, your hands and your feet, for example. The minute that you desire to move your hands and feet, then your hands and feet are nullified to your desire, and they move immediately. The minute you desire to move your limbs, they move. They are, in other words, completely all they are is a vehicle for the expression of your desire. So when a person does the mitzvot, does the commandments of God, which are called the 248 positive commandments, which is actually doing something actively, then with their physical body, then what happens is that their physical body along with the intellect of the godly soul, the emotions of the godly soul, like we're saying, become a mere vehicle for God's desire, for God's will. And that's the idea of a limb, of God's limbs, that a person is becoming nullified to. So those are from the positive side of actively doing something. Now there is the negative side of the hayira, which is the fear. The fear, the awe, I should translate really, is maybe a better explanation. Is the source, the emotional fear is the source of the 365 negative commandments, which is God saying, don't do this, don't do that. Don't eat chametz on Pesach, or whatever the negative commandment might be. Ki, why? Which is a fear that a person feels or to rebel against God, to get in trouble, right? Or a deeper level of awe, to be, so to speak, in shame of doing something against the greatness of God. As we know, there's two kinds of fear. There's the lower level of fear. I don't know if fear is a good translation, awe maybe. And then there's a higher kind of awe. The lower level of fear is being afraid of something that the sin is going to cause the person, the negative that's going to come from the sin. Like it's going to make something happen to me, God forbid. And then that's a lower level of fear. Basically, how is the sin going to affect me? And I'm afraid of it affecting me negatively. And the higher level of fear, of awe, is being that God is so great. Therefore, if there's something against what God wants, I don't want to touch it. I'm afraid of anything that is against God's will. In other words, I'm afraid of the sin itself, being that it's God. In other words, it's something that's against what God wants. In other words, it's something that is not because it's going to cause something bad to me, but it's just because God decided it's bad. I'm already out. I don't want to touch it again. I don't want to touch it. And it's not necessarily staying away from things that are forbidden, but even just having a certain awe, an emotion of feeling like I'm not necessarily free to myself. When I go out on the street and so on, I'm not opening my eyes, I'm not opening my ears to anything that's out there. I'm reserved. I have a feeling of awe because there's something higher than me. There's a super being, so to speak. There's God. And therefore, I'm not just open to anything that I see. I'm not looking at anything, even if it's not forbidden. So that's the idea of awe. Now, that is the source, that is the root of fulfilling practically the 635 negative commandments, which are things that God hates, that is despised by God, which are, in general, the two categories of klipa and sitra achra, which are the really one thing, which are two different explanations of the negative energies, so to speak, which are things that are anti-God, like we mentioned earlier in chapter 1. You can look it up over there. The negative energies become attached to the person and juice off of the person when a person transgresses one of the 635 sins, or things that they're not supposed to do. And it's like, just like everything is parallel in this world. Anything in holiness you have also in negativity and things that are not holy. So the same way, when a person fulfills a positive commandment, a positive mitzvah, they're actually feeding to holiness. They're feeding to kedusha. When you do a mitzvah, when you put on tefillin, or when you keep Shabbat, for example, then you're adding to holiness. So too, the negative energies, which is called sitra achra, let's just say, feed off of a person's sins, feed off of a person's transgressions. And the example is from a shot of arrows coming at a person and hitting a person. that the way to block the arrows is to stand behind a wall, to stand behind something that's a shield, that's blocking them. When a person, so too, when it comes to fulfilling the negative commandments, to staying away, saying no to things that God wants us to stay away from, that puts up a shield and it blocks off the, so to speak, arrows that are flying from the negative energies, and they can't touch us. It's a shield, it's a guard, that this way they can't attach themselves to us. Through the 365 negative commandments. Okay. והנה שלושת הלבושים אלו מהתורה מצוותיה אף שנקראים לבושים לנפש רוח ונשמה עם כל זה גבה וגד למעלת מלאין קץ וסוף על מעלת רוח ונשמה עצמן. These three garments of the mitzvot, of the 613 commandments, thought, speech, and action, even though they're just garments, there's something outside of yourself, of let's say your 10 levels, your intellect and emotions, even though it's something that's, so to speak, outside of you and superficial, it's still much, much, much greater than a person's self, than a person's intellect and emotions. How come the 613 mitzvot are much greater? So he gives a whole explanation over here. The Torah, which is the source of the 613 commandments, and God are one. The Torah and God are one. That's what the Zohar says. Pirush, Deoraita hi chokhmato v'retzono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. והקדוש ברוך הוא בכבודו בעצמו כול אחד, כי הוא היודע והוא המדע חולו, כמו שכתוב לעיל בשם הרמב"ם. Because the Torah is God's wisdom. Now, being that it's God's wisdom and God are one. Because as we know, everything is one. He, like we said before, is the knower, the knowledge, and the thought, the thing that is known. All at once, as we mentioned earlier in chapter 2. Let's see over there, the beginning of chapter 2. In the name of the Rambam, we mentioned this. So, in other words, the Torah is one with God, being that God is one with the Torah. It's God's wisdom. It's all one. Now, 1 second. God, now hold on a minute. The Torah is one with God, but God is infinite, so to speak. Then how can we grasp the Torah? We just said the Torah is basically one with God. So how in the world can we have an understanding of God? Our minds are limited. There's only so much a human brain can understand. You're expecting us to understand the Torah, which is God, so to speak. It's one with God. How can it be possible that we should understand Him? And as we know, the verses prove this. It says that there's no limitations to understanding God. And if you try to understand God, will you succeed? And so too, my thoughts, says God, are not your thoughts. So how can we understand the Torah? Right? If the Torah is one with God, there's something wrong over here. How can we understand the Torah? The Torah is one with God. God is infinite, so to speak. In the place where you find God's greatness, that's where you find His humility. In other words, because God is so great, therefore He's able to humble Himself. Because of the greatness that He has, He's able to come down into something lowly and something physical, like the practical, physical commandments, the 613 commandments and the Torah. And it's like, for example, when you have someone that's very wise, they're going to be able to make small decisions. Specifically because they're so wise. The wiser a person is, the more wise a person is, the better they're going to be able to make small decisions. Like, for example, what food to eat, let's say, or how to calculate their schedule, or how to journey to a certain place. The small decisions can be made best by a very wise person. The wiser person is, the better they can do it. And that's the same thing with God. Because, so to speak, God's wisdom is so great, therefore, specifically for that reason, because of the greatness of it, therefore it's able to come into small things, small details, like the physical understanding that we have of the Torah. So God limited, He made his wisdom smaller. Not just his wisdom, his will and wisdom, that, as we said before, is one with him. He limited them and made them smaller into the 613 commandments of the Torah and their laws, which is their intellectual understandings of them, and also into the Torah, and also into the interpretations of the Torah and the Agadic explanations and the Midrashic explanations of our sages of blessed memory. He limited and made them smaller into those things, into the Torah, into the mitzvot. בכדי שכל הנשמה או רוח ונפש שבגוף האדם תוכל להשיג מדעתה ולקיים כל מה שאפשר לקיים מהן במעשה, דיבור ומחשבה. In order that any single Jew, any person can have a certain thought, speech, or action, a person's thought, speech, or action to be able to actually grasp God's, so to speak, thoughts, wisdom, will and wisdom, as much as they're able to, as much as a person is able to. And through that, all the intellectual faculties of a person, the emotional faculties of a person, are garbed by God's, so to speak, intellect, will or intellect, which is God, one with God himself, which therefore that means that when a person is doing in thought, speech, and action something that is containing the expression of one of the mitzvot, they are actually becoming a vehicle for the expression of God himself. And how, again, can God come down into such a low place? So we have a beautiful example that's brought from King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, who was the wisest man of all time. So wise he could speak to animals, and he's famous for being wise. It said about him that he would have to, in order to actually have to relate an intellectual thought that he had to a regular person, he would have to make 3,000 parables in order for it to be understood, because his wisdom was so intellectually great that it couldn't be grasped by someone normal. So he would make a parable so it could be more understood. But that parable that he made, the first parable, is also too great and too lofty for a regular, simple person. So he'd have to make a second parable, a parable of the parable. But the second parable also was too great to be understood. So he had to make a third parable. But that also was too great, and so on and so forth, until he had to literally make 3,000 parables in order for a simple person to understand his great wisdom. So too God's wisdom is so great that he, so to speak, makes a parable after parable after parable after parable until it can actually be understood in our physical minds. That's the idea of God bringing down his wisdom, which is one with him, down to us. And when a person does this, like we said, then they actually are bringing up their godly soul's intellect, their godly soul's emotions, and garbing it with God himself. As we know, the mitzvot, the commandments, below in physicality, actually raise up and actually uplift the godly soul that's in the body. For example, as we know, when it says that giving tzedakah, in other words, giving, I guess, charity might be the best understood explanation, saves a person from death. It's a famous quote. So too, the tefillin that a person wears, it says about them that when the Jewish people wear the tefillin, then all of the surrounding nations will see that God's name is upon us, and then they will fear from us. So we see how the mitzvot uplift the soul that's in the body. Another example would be learning Torah, which protects from any kinds of enemies on the inside or on the outside. And especially in the days of the temple, when the temple stood, that their entire life force depended upon the fulfillment of the mitzvot, like the sacrifices, the korbanot that they brought, and the service of the high priest in the temple on Yom Kippur, when we know that the high priest would change from white garments to gold garments, back to white garments, back to gold garments. These mitzvot, the fulfillment of these commandments, would be the source of life and vitality for the general populace of the Jewish people. So we see how the mitzvot actually garb the person with God in themselves, and they uplift the person, the body, everything, through the three garments of the mitzvot. And even someone who is a sinner and is, so to speak, a very simple person that's far from godly things, when they do a mitzvah, when they fulfill, they perform in thought, speech, or action a mitzvah, then they become a vehicle for the revelation of God Himself. Blessed be He. Or Ein Sof, blessed be He. It doesn't matter the person. Once they wear one of the three garments of the mitzvot, then they are a vehicle. So that means anytime that you do a mitzvah, you're becoming a vehicle for God in this world. That's literally what we're saying. So now, therefore, the Torah, which came from such a high place, is referred to as water. What's water? The same way that water comes down from a very high place, top of a mountain, for example, and comes down to a very low place, down on the ground, down on the earth, in the ocean, let's say, which is very low, from high to low. So too the Torah came down from the place of glory, which is the will and wisdom of God, and the Torah and God are one, and no thought grasps God. He's beyond everything. And from there, it journeyed down in the hidden stages, from level to level, in the chain of the worlds. As we know that there's many heavenly worlds, the Torah came down through all those heavenly worlds, because in every world, the Torah is there according to the world's level. More spiritual, some worlds are more spiritual than other worlds, so the Torah is on each world on its own level, until it came down and was garbed in physical things, vinyane olam hazeh, and the things of this world, which are the majority and almost all of the mitzvot of the Torah, the commandments of the Torah, and their laws, in physical ink on the book of the scroll of the Torah, the 24 books of the Tanakh of the Torah. Why did it come down so low into physical things? As we know, the mitzvot are all physical, like tefillin are physical, the tzitzit that we wear are physical commandment, and so on and so forth. Even commandments that are a little bit more spiritual, like love and fear, are just the idea of accepting God's yoke of heaven in order to do physical things. So it comes out that really Torah and mitzvot, as it comes down, are all about physical action, doing physical things. Why did it come down so low? In order that any thought can grasp them. It doesn't matter who the person is. And even the lower levels lower than thought, which are speech and action, are able to grasp the Torah. They're able to grasp the mitzvot through doing a mitzvah and so on. They're grasping this great will of God and wisdom of God, which came down from the highest of highs, from the place of glory, from God Himself, which is one with God, and it's coming down and giving a person access to have God. And The reason also we compare it to water is like water at first is something that is just potential. It's something that's not definable. It's beyond definition. It has a potential to grow plants and to be used for many different activities. And once then you take that potential of the water and you use it for something small, like you plant a tree or a seed, whatever, with the water, then you're taking the potential that was there, that was undefined, and defining it and bringing it into something practical, into a plant. So to the Torah, the way it is above by God, one with God, it's undefined. It's beyond definition. It's one with God. And just has a potential to be defined eventually. And then once it comes down into the worlds, eventually it gets more defined and more defined and more defined and more defined until it's so defined that it comes into a physical state. Now, being that the Torah and the Mitzvot are garbing the 10 levels of the soul, the intellect and emotions, and the 613 limbs of the soul, from head to toe. So that means that the entire soul, your entire godly soul, and also by extension the body and animal soul as well, as we're going to discuss in another place in Tanya, is bound up. Your entire being is bound up with the bound of life. Et Hashem mamash, the God literally. You're literally being bound up with God. Anytime you learn Torah, anytime you do mitzvot, you're bound with God Himself, literally. Ve'or Hashem mamash, and God's light literally, makifa, surrounds, umalbisha, and clothes the soul, merosha v'ad ragla, from its head to its toe, to its foot. As it says in the verse, Tsuri echesebo, the verse says, the rock in which I take refuge. When a person takes refuge from something, they're being surrounded by the refuge. So too, my rock is referring to God, is so to speak my refuge. He's surrounding me when I'm doing Torah and Mitzvot. Uchtiv, another verse, with a shield, God's will surrounds him. As with a shield, God's will surrounds him. Which refers to God's will and wisdom, which are enclosed in God's Torah and God's mitzvot. In other words, God Himself is enclosed in the Torah and the mitzvot that we do, and therefore, by extension, when we learn Torah, when we do mitzvot, we're being bound up with God. Now we're going to actually give a beautiful explanation. There's a statement. The statement from our sages. It's better to have one moment of teshuvah, which is the idea of doing God's will and good deeds, basically doing the mitzvot in this world for 1 second, for one moment, is greater than the entire life of heaven and the next world. Doing a mitzvah is greater than the next world. Just one moment of doing a mitzvah is greater than the entire heaven. Because, ki, olam haba, hu shenani nuziv shechina shutaynu g'hasaga. The next world in heaven, what are they doing there? What are people busy, or the souls I should say, what are the souls busy in heaven doing? They're sitting there basking in God's ray of light. And how do they bask in God's ray of light? Through their intellect, through their understanding. Now, it's impossible. It's impossible for any creation, it doesn't matter how high, to grasp God. Because like we said, God's beyond our grasp, anyone's grasp. The only thing that a creation can grasp, that a soul in heaven can grasp, is a ray, something small of God's light. So it's like a tiny little thing that they're grasping in heaven, which is infinitely lower and more limited than God Himself. And therefore, it's called the ray of God. God in His full glory and Himself, no thought can grasp, because He's beyond grasp. The only way to grasp God is when a person grasps the Torah or the mitzvot with the three garments that we mentioned, thought, speech, and action. That's the only way. Then they are grasping the Torah, and they are becoming engarbed and enclosed in God completely. As we said earlier, the Torah and God are one. Now, even though at the end of the day we're still left with a question, how come the Torah is speaking about physical things? How can you say that it's one with God? That God garbs Himself in these physical things? Right? The entire Torah is always speaking about things that are physical. Let's say, for example, animals and so on and so forth, right? So we can explain this through an example of hugging a king, giving a hug to the king himself. Ben mechabko shu levush levush echad, ben shu levush kama levushim me'achar shuguf hamelech betocham. It doesn't make a difference when you're hugging a king whether he's wearing one garment of clothing or whether the king is wearing many garments of clothing, because the body of the king is inside those garments. So too, even though the Torah is a garment of God's wisdom, it's an outer garment of God's wisdom, but while using the Torah in your, while expressing the Torah in your thought, speech, and action, you're giving Hashem, you're giving God a nice big hug. Even though it might be that there's a garment in between you and God, but God is beneath that garment. So God is inside there, and it's literally like you're hugging God. Every time you're learning Torah, you do mitzvah, you're hugging God. וכן אם המלך מחבקו בזרועו, גם שהיא מלובשת תוך מלבושיו, כמו שכתוב וימינו תחבקני, שהיא התוך השנית מימין, שבחינת חסד ומים. And so too, when not just you're hugging God, but vice versa, it's also the other way, God hugging you with His arms, so to speak. When the king hugs a person with their arms, that the king's arm is inside his clothing, obviously. It doesn't make a difference, because it's the king inside the clothing. As the verse says, his right hand hugs me, which refers to the Torah, which is given from the right, which is the level of kindness and water. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.